we saw him, and I had seen him speak extemporaneously in beautiful, fully formed chapters, and not slowly either. I'm confident that a recording of what I heard would scarcely need editing if it were going to be a book. He corrected me in front of the audience, of course, noting that his extemp talks and the answers to the questions that he'd been answering earlier really came on topics that he'd been studying for years. That's a poor excuse for the fine performances that I've seen him give. A truly remarkable individual, Richard Epstein.
One filled with all of the grace that is associated with staged appearances. The lights are really quite something. Also, by the way, I noticed just as Rick got up, the music started to play, and I assumed that that meant that I was supposed to do a two-step in addition to speak about something having to do with the public trust doctrines. And if you hear those occasional applauses, I suspect that they've understood what's gone on here far better than any of you, and therefore are giving you gentle hints, which if you follow, I will be most grateful for. So anyhow, I'm happy to do both two numbers, one song and dance routine with respect to folks across the thing, and the other another song and dance routine which has to do with some aspects of American legal theory, common and constitutional law, and that I suppose has to do with the question of the public trust doctrine, how we ought to understand it, and what, if anything, we ought to do with it. And as is always the case at conferences like this, there's a certain kind of divine coordination with respect to topics. As I was sitting down this afternoon trying to figure out how I would begin my speech, I heard Mr. Bish give his talk. And what he did, in effect, was to give a talk in which the question before the House was whether or not the system of federalism, which has divided states and national control, is sufficient to handle the problem of the commons. That is, a situation in which various state delegations go in and try to take a somewhat larger portion of the total wealth for their own state than they will leave for any other state. And he came up with the somewhat somber conclusion that we weren't quite sure whether or not the system of federalism would hold against the various tendencies of state delegation and other groups to try to get slightly more than their pro rata share of the total take. And this, of course, leads in very naturally to the kind of topic that I'm talking about, which is the public trust. And the reason is that the public trust doctrine, like a whole variety of other doctrines which have to do with individual liberties, is essentially another way of trying to get at the same problem of the commons. Whereas there are monies or other property which is held in common by the government, and various types of individuals are trying to get more than their pro rata share of that common resource for their own private gain. And therefore, what one should do is to understand that in dealing with constitutional doctrine generally, and with questions of public defalcation in particular, the basic principle that you wish to believe is one of redundancy. That is, the strategism that individuals can devise is sufficiently multifarious, sufficiently clever, and sufficiently persistent that no one single set of techniques is going to be sufficient unto the day to keep them in line. And when you design a constitution, you don't want to create the Maginot Line mentality of trying to put all your eggs into one basket. So to the common question, which I think divides a large number of American constitutional scholars, do we put our trust in structural protections on the one hand, be they federalism or separation of powers, or do we put our trust in various protections of individual rights entrenched in the Bill of Rights? The answer to that question is we put our trust in both, and the only question is how many resources do you have, and which way at the margin is it more efficient to develop them one to another. Now, I can't answer the great question of substitution in the time that's left to me. Indeed, I'm not even quite sure how I would answer it if I had all the time in the world. So what I want to do today is to start to figure out how it is that one would take the public trust doctrine, whatever that is, and I will describe it briefly later, and see the way in which it could be converted into an understanding of how it is that common law and constitutional rules might in combination be used to limit the power of government so that it performs those functions which it ought to perform, but doesn't engage in the excesses that we try to prevent the Hobbesian sovereign from doing. And in order to give you some handle about it, let me just start with two kinds of simple-minded maxims which constantly appear in ordinary discourse, but generally are not given any systematic explanation. Then, having stated the dilemma, let me see if I could take the general theory of eminent domain, twist it a little bit so as to make the whole problem of public trust part and parcel of a larger inquiry of how individual rights can be protected by constitutionalism against intrusion. Well, one of these maxims is, of course, very old, and it says that a public office is a public trust. and everybody sits down there and they nod knowingly, and then they go off and they start to think about something else because they have the usual low estimation that most of us have of our public trustees. And it seems to me that one of the things that we ought to do with this maxim is not forget it, but to take it extremely seriously, and to recognize that the private law of trust, which deals with exactly the same kinds of arrangements, indeed imposes an enormous amount of restrictions upon the ways in which trustees can deal with trust property, including those which are designed to prevent various kinds of self-dealing between the trust corpus on the one hand and the trust on the other. And to the extent that one tries to use private analogies as a source for understanding what public law is about, maybe this maxim turns out to contain a little bit more firepower than the customary dismissive attitude towards it would otherwise suggest. And the other point that one wants to mention comes from other areas of common law, in which we are told, again very solemnly, that when you are dealing with certain kinds of public property, we have to understand that they are inherently inalienable by the sovereign. And my own attitude towards that, which I think is shared by a large number of other people, is that whenever you hear the word inherently or essentially predicated before any other words, what somebody is telling you in rather elaborate philosophical jargon is the following. We see a rule, which a certain property is inalienable, and we don't understand exactly why it is or ought to be the case. And so rather than confess our ignorance, what we will do is retreat to a higher level of philosophical abstraction and pretend that it has to be in the nature of things, assuming, of course, that everybody knows politely and precisely what the nature of things really is. But the argument, it seems to me, nonetheless is still of some value, notwithstanding that methodological caveat. That is, when you find out that there is a long-standing, persistent rule, and you're never quite sure where it arose, but nonetheless that you see it manages to hold on tenaciously against all of the attacks on it, chances are it contains a modicum of good sense. And so what that rule ought to do is to suggest to you exactly the same thing as our first little maxim suggests, which is maybe if you look a little bit more closely at the inalienability of public property, you will be able to find some clue as to what is going on. And of course, it's a very difficult and important question because we have an elaborate theory of private property rights. And for the most part, if you were to ask people what it is about private property which renders it both valuable and distinctive, one of the elements that they would give in the answer is its alienability. And the function of alienability is to say, if I don't want it as much as you do, we can find a price which somehow or other effectively splits the difference and makes both of us better off by virtue of the exchange, so that essentially without alienability of property you don't have markets, and without markets you have stagnation. So if you find in effect a rule which prohibits alienability of certain kinds of property, you have to ask why it is that the restriction manages to endure when prima facie it appears that it ought to be highly inefficient. So that we now have two ways of looking at this problem, or two handles on the question. And now the issue is, how can we put them together in terms of some kind of a synthetic theory? Well, the first thing, it seems to me, is that we have to ask ourselves, what's the relationship between a theory of public property and a theory of private property? And here what I do want to do for at least a minute or two is to go back to stuff that I've written at some length on with respect to private property, and to talk about the major constitutional protection of private property, which is found in the Fifth Amendment. And for those of you who don't remember what it says, maybe because you've been reading too many Supreme Court opinions, what it says, in effect, is that nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. And what I want to suggest is that there's another missing constitutional clause which ought to be put side by side with it, which is nor shall public property be taken for private use without just compensation, and treat the two as though they are mirror images of one another. Now, once you do that, it all of a sudden becomes exceedingly clear that you have, at least if you understand matters aright, a rather large subject matter that you're going to have to deal with in connection with the public trust doctrine, which now becomes the public just compensation doctrine, or the public eminent domain clause. To give you some idea of just how vast an inquiry it is, it's probably instructive to step back for a minute or two and to ask the question of what makes a sensible interpretation of the plain old eminent domain clause which we find present in our existing Constitution, and which is, I think, subject to a strict interpretation which yields nonetheless some very radical results. Before I get into this, however, I do want to say something about interpretivism, which bears on remarks that were made today, particularly in the discussions with Forrest McDonald. That is, you can be an extremely strict constructionist and still believe that a clause has very broad and powerful implications in the way in which it limits government. Strict construction is only an effort to try to take the words on their face and to make sense of them. It is not an effort to try to engraft upon the art of construction or interpretation some kind of hidden extra-constitutional presumption which says that all constitutional guarantees ought to be construed narrowly, or all constitutional guarantees ought to be construed broadly, or more insidiously, the constitutional guarantees I like ought to be construed broadly and the rest of them could go hang. That's not what you're after. In effect, what you're trying to do is to figure out the logical connections between propositions that were contained with the clause, and to be extremely aware that when you start to read in exceptions to the document as written, they have to be comprehensive or consistent or congruent with the basic kind of intellectual theory which animates the clause itself. It's not as though there are no exceptions to various kinds of constitutional provisions. Of course there are, but they simply cannot be wild cards which allow you to neutralize whatever the express text wants to state. So when we start to get to eminent domain, in effect, the first intuition that you want to have is, what's the scope of the protection? And here it seems to me that we all ought to be card-carrying Marxists with respect to the question. That is, if you ask Karl Marx what's wrong with capitalism, what's wrong with America, what's wrong with a large number of Western democracies, he would say it's that private property turns out to be their most pervasive and comprehensive social institution, and the only way in which you could set things right would be to abolish the entire institution, root and branch, and replace it with the collective ownership of the means of production. So, if that's what private property is, when you have a clause which protects it, in effect they say that the one thing that you cannot do is to enact exactly that kind of a program. And so, for example, when we see Mr. Justice Holmes in Lochner, New York, tell us, well, the Constitution doesn't enact Mr. Herbert Spencer's social statics, and you start looking at some of the provisions, after a while you're not so sure. The protection that we give to private property is, in fact, covering the entire domain. The Constitution doesn't say land, it doesn't say copyrights, it doesn't say easements, it says private property of all forms, kinds, and descriptions. And the kind of protection that it has is against takings of all kinds, sorts, and descriptions. So that when I start to work out the implications of the theory, what you have to do is to ask, how is it that a government can take property from various kinds of individuals? And it turns out virtually anything that it will do will be in one way, shape, or form of taking of the property from those individuals and giving it typically to somebody else, or maybe back to the people from whom it's taken. And so when I worked this through the book, what I argued in effect is that we can identify three kinds of takings which are perfectly consistent with the basic text of the eminent domain clause and which therefore call for constitutional scrutiny. One of them is all forms of taxation, in effect the taking from large numbers of individuals, put into some kind of a public purse, and then we'll have to worry about the distribution of benefits from the taxes that are so collected. Then, in effect, you could make, I think, very powerfully exactly the same argument with various forms of public regulations, whether they be restrictions in the form of wage and price control, or zoning, or land use controls of any sort, kind, of description. And the third thing is any kind of modification of various kinds of common law liability rules which protect private property fall into the same category. And lest anybody doubt that on the theory that tort liability and property have nothing in common, imagine yourself in a universe in which we decided tomorrow that all actions for trespass are abolished. So that in effect, if somebody decides to come and sit on your land, there's nothing that you can do to get them off, whether by common law action or, to make things even nicer, by way of self-help. This is only a modification of a small common law tort rule, and yet it turns out that this so-called small common law tort rule lies at the root of all of our organized civilization. And the only thing that's small about it is its lack of controversy, not its lack of importance, and one ought to be exceedingly careful in the way in which you keep these two things together. Now, if you start with this view of private property, then it turns out that somebody will say, well, government can't act at all. And so that what happens is you've not created a constitution, but instead you've created some kind of a suicide pact. But it turns out that that's wrong. And the reason it's wrong is that if you look at the opposite side of the equation, it turns out that there are all sorts of ways in which you can take property, to wit, under those circumstances in which you provide just compensation to those people who have taken it. And when you get into the form of large and comprehensive social regulation, one of the things that you must do to be consistent is to recognize that the forms of compensation that are available to individuals will in fact include more than simple cash transfer payments to those people from whom property has been taken. There's a whole variety of benefits that regulation, that taxation, that modification of liability rules can confer upon other individuals, and what the Constitution in effect requires by the just compensation provision is that person by person, because remember, we're methodological individualists. That is, we take all statements about aggregates and reduce them to statements about individual persons. It basically requires that each and every person receive some form of an equivalent from everybody else, or from this particular comprehensive government program, which leaves him at least as well off as he was in the prior state of the world. And for those of you who heard this talk this morning by Jim Buchanan, it's very close to the Wickselian criterion with respect to unanimity. What it says, in effect, is that if you could find a program which generates some aggregate gain, in principle, you could find a way so that the benefits will be distributed so that this particular kind of condition will be satisfied. That is, leaving everybody better off and nobody worse off than before. And all that we have to be careful about is to recognize that in making these calculations, you have to take into account the full pattern and forms of benefits associated with individuals and governments. Now, this kind of a matching program, in effect, does impose very serious questions with respect to the way in which you determine who's better off and who's worse off. And it turns out, therefore, you have to find all sorts of clever techniques in order to handle it. One of the chief techniques that one would use would be one which asks whether or not the patterns of benefits and burdens are skewed in a way which leave them somewhat asymmetrical. So, for example, if the benefits turn out to be evenly distributed across all individuals and the burdens turn out to be heavily skewed, chances are you don't have a public interest type statute. What happens is that you have, under the name of public interest, is some kind of an implicit transfer from one group of individuals to another, or as one might say, from A to B in ways which violate the Constitution. And if you take this methodology, it turns out that you're entitled to make a rather extensive romp through the statute book, and we'll discover, I think, that most of the standard 20th century New Deal legislation is in fact designed to flunk any appropriate standard of social welfare which comes out of what I think is a fair reading of the eminent domain clause. And this is a straight textual argument which happens to be consistent with various kinds of sound social programs, not because you're trying to read the text in ways that go against its original meaning, but rather because the fellows who drafted the text had themselves a fairly good and powerful understanding of what the principles of sound government would require. Now, when you switch this thing over and you start to deal with the public side, it seems to me that you could start to ask exactly the same kinds of questions that you can with respect to private property and try to address and understand them in connection with public property. So you're going to start to ask the questions of how it is that public property is going to be acquired and what it is that the government could do with that property once that it has it. And the public trust doctrine at common law and the public trust doctrine with its shadowy constitutional status is in effect an effort to try to make sure that with respect to other kinds of property, to with public property, that same even-handed distribution of benefits and burdens which is constitutionally required with respect to private property is also observed. The question is, how could we make this analysis go? Well, I think the first question that you want to ask under these circumstances is this: how is it that any state or any government manages to acquire public property? And it turns out that there are a wide variety of answers, all of which I think deserve some degree of mention. Well, one way in which the government can acquire property, in fact, is by gift or bequest. It turns out that there are an odd number of citizens every year who decide to leave things to the state of Florida or to the United States in gratitude for all that has been done by this country for them. Mr. Holmes left his literary estate to the United States, Mr. Justice Holmes, on precisely those kinds of reasons. So that's one way that the government can acquire property. The second way in which government can acquire property is by condemnation. Oftentimes what it does is it condemns property, say land, in order to use as a post office for a public highway, and presumably when the government has it, it holds it in the trust for the public whose tax dollars it used in order to condemn the property in question. And the third class of property that one has is this funny kind of public trust property at common law, which is property which inherently is said to belong to the state and which it does not have to acquire by condemnation. And the most common illustration of that, for example, has to do with navigable waterways. And one of the things that we typically discover is that whereas the banks and sometimes the mineral rights with respect to navigable waterways may be either privately owned or capable of alienation into private hands, the waterway itself is something which is said to be inherently public and which cannot be conveyed out to any private hand. The question is, why would that kind of restriction make any sense? And is there any particular way that we could generalize from the particular case in order to have a really fairly comprehensive view of what it is that governments could do with public funds, no matter how acquired? In order to answer this question, it seems to me that one of the things that we have to do is to ask ourselves, why is it that one would want to put this public river into public ownership. And here let me say that there's a clue. That many times when people start to talk about rivers, they talk about them as highways for navigation. The moment you hear that, then you have to start thinking about other kinds of highways, and note that typically these are required by the acquisition of the eminent domain power. Well, the first thing you want to ask is, why do we need the eminent domain power in order to acquire land for highways? Why don't we acquire it in the voluntary market? And what we typically discover is that there's an enormous risk of holdout, because you have to assemble parcels by large numbers of individuals, where any single person owning a very small and narrow strip of land strategically located can completely dissipate the entire value of the road. And what one achieves by virtue of the eminent domain power is a way to prevent the kinds of market failures associated with blockade, holds-out, bargaining games, and so forth. And that this is in fact simply writ small, the same kinds of problems that you have associated with comprehensive social regulation for pollution, or for the provision of defense through the raising of tax dollars and so forth. And what the state does in effect is it raises taxes from those who have benefits, uses some of that money to pay off the road, increases the total degree of social welfare in ways that make everybody the gainer. Well, it would be very nice to say, why don't we do exactly the same thing with respect to the river? Why don't we simply announce that these things are held in private hands at the front end, and then go through the same routes with respect to condemnation, so as to make it in parity with the highway? And it turns out that there are rather neat functional differences which explain the disparity with respect to the two kinds of cases. And the first one, and the critical one, is this. It seems to me that when you're asking the question about should we condemn land for a highway, one of the key questions we're asking is, where ought that land to be? And there is no way at the time that people originally settled land that you could figure the optimal location of any kind of a road. Rather, it's the kind of question which is going to depend upon the way in which trade and commerce develop in the fullness of time. So that you don't know which land it is that you want for a highway. And what the compensation requirement of the eminent domain clause does is it disciplines people in a way that they are now under instructions to try to pick that land which maximizes net value. If in fact you don't have a compensation requirement, everybody's going to say, sure, you should take land for the public highway, but make sure that it's somebody else's. And what the compensation requirement does is it buys off the kinds of opposition and prevents the strategic behavior which would otherwise dissipate the gain from the collective enterprise. The point about rivers is you don't have that problem. That is, you know where the river is, where it starts, where it moves, and where it ends, and there may be some problems about maintenance of the right-of-way and so forth. But it turns out, generally speaking, there is no question of strategic behavior, because there's only one way the river will run, and nature has determined that course. Under these circumstances, if you treat the thing as though it's inherently owned by the state at the front end, what happens is you manage to avoid all of the necessary costs that are otherwise incurred in the assemblage of the property. And so what the basic theorem is leave property in private hands where that minimizes bilateral monopoly problems and bargaining problems, but where in fact collective ownership can be seen to minimize those same problems, then assign the original position in the opposite direction. And whereas highways and riverways seem to have very similar functions, it turns out that the bargaining patterns with respect to the selection of location are vastly different. Now the question is, what should we do with respect to the alienation of this property once it's in public hands? And here it seems to me that we ought to draw a very powerful distinction between components of value with respect to the river. For example, if you take the traditional common law doctrines, you will discover that the state typically owns two things. It will own the waterway, that is the navigation easement, and in many jurisdictions, including Florida, it will own, under the heading of sovereignty land, as it's called in this state, it will own the right to mineral extractions from the waterbed of the river, usually defined as the area between the mean or the ordinary high water marks on both sides of the riverbed. And typically it turns out that the mineral rights under the waterbed are alienable, whereas the water rights themselves are not. And the question you have to ask, why the distinction? And it seems to me that the answer is pretty much straightforward. If you're going to talk about the mineral rights, it turns out that the original assignment in the public, say in this case by grant from the federal government, is such that you can be pretty confident the state's not going to do a very good job with respect to the development in question. It has no natural advantage when it comes to ordinary mining. And therefore, it's pretty easy to imagine a set of circumstances in which a private sale will benefit both the purchaser on the one hand and the public fisc on the other hand by improving the productive value of the assets in question. So here what you need is a kind of protection against public abuse which takes the form of the just compensation requirement. What you want to do is to scrutinize that transaction just as you would scrutinize a transaction entered into by a private trustee to make sure that they're not giving away the property at something below market value. If in fact you give the property away at below market value, all the other citizens, apart from the recipient, will in fact find that their stock on the public accounts has been reduced by the loss of the minerals, which is in a way which is not offset by the increment of cash to the state. And in addition, the very opportunity to acquire property below market value will create all sorts of dangers of rent dissipation, all sorts of dangers of political intrigue, as everybody spends real resources in order to get the advantage of the favorable settlement or the favorable purchase, and those resources spent on acquisition will be deadweight losses rather than simple transfer payments. And so what we do is we impose upon the state some kind of a just compensation requirement. You have to make sure that they're getting fair value back, and you could do that either by having independent appraisals and audits, or by having competitive bids, or allowing citizens to challenge the transaction as being inadequate after the time. And this technology is perfectly well known and understood, because whenever you have a transaction in which a corporation, for example, sells some of its assets to its own shareholders, you typically will scrutinize that transaction to make sure that the transaction is not in defalcation of the interests of minority shareholders. And the way to understand this is to treat the citizen and the shareholders as essentially functional analogs. But let us suppose that you thought a priori that there was good reason to believe that there was absolutely no social gain which could be achieved by making the transfer from public to private hands. Well, under those circumstances, the right rule is not to go through the elaborate charade on seeing whether or not compensation is appropriate. The right rule is to ban the transaction in its entirety. And here, with respect to public waterways, we have pretty good intuitions that, in fact, the transaction ought to be banned. Why? Because if you make the voluntary transaction, what happens is you're now giving somebody the position to hold up with respect to the road. So if you start selling off navigation rights, what you do is you create the same blockade situation that the eminent domain power was designed to prevent. And so therefore, you're quite confident that the partition of the river is in effect going to work a decrease in value, which means that no amount of money can in effect compensate people for the real resources involved. And hence, what happens is you can have a kind of a general theorem which says that when you have open access, which gets you something close to a competitive type of solution with free entry, what the state can't do is to convert this into a kind of monopoly system where in fact that you expect that the social losses from the imposition of a high set of tariffs by the new private owners will in fact result in a form of social losses. So what you do is you have a case in which it turns out the transfer of public property to private hands results in a total loss, so therefore you cannot have the appropriate form of just compensation under my modified eminent domain clause, which says that public property cannot be conveyed or taken for private use without just compensation. Now this whole model, which talks about government owning assets in ways which make them property in common, has, it seems to me, a wide variety of applications to other kinds of areas. And let me just mention a few of them. Some of them might be reasonably well understood. Others, I think, are perhaps somewhat more unexpected. The first case that I always like to use is a case of plain old ordinary language. And if you reflect about it, in some sense, English, for the most part, is, in fact, as a language, a public good. There is no one who has essentially the exclusive right to use the language and can prevent all other individuals from doing so. And the reason is, just think of the utility of the language if there were only one speaker of it. It would essentially be a situation in which we could not communicate, and the very gains that are associated with languages are normally associated with their wide non-exclusive use, and any privatization of the language would go very much against it. And so if we had a legislature which says that only 4 people in the United States were entitled to speak English, and they got some sort of a grant to that form, we would say, if that's the kind of public asset, to try to convey it into private hands would be exceedingly suspect. Now there are, however, various other kinds of exceptions, and let me consider 2. One, if you start to think about the whole doctrine with respect to trademarks, many times what people do is they invest real resources in order to create private secondary meanings of given kinds of terms. Monopoly may be a state of the market. It's also a board game by Parker Brothers. Sorry may be a way of saying I'm sorry. And on the other hand, it's a game I play with my little boy 7 nights a week, every week, to the point where I wish that one would find another game. So under those circumstances, the board games get protection, whereas the generic uses do not, because of the patterns of private investment that are reflected in the privatization of the rights. But more to our point, suppose you found a single term which was in common usage, and what you decided to do by legislation was to convey it out to a single individual. And here there's actually a statute on the book which tries to create, in effect, private rights in the word Olympic for the National Olympic Committee, which sponsors the United States participation in the Games. Now, my view is it's no different from the waterway. Here you have a term in which there's a wide-scale set of investments, and what the government does is it conveys it off to one group, which doesn't have to purchase it. And to the extent that they turn out to be net winners, there are going to be other individuals whose loss of this particular piece of common property is going to make them net losers. And to the extent that you have uncompensated transfers, real resources will be introduced in order to bring them about. So you're quite confident that the general game is going to be negative sum. And so if you take the public use kind of doctrine seriously, there's nothing which says that it only applies to navigable waterways. The exact same arguments will apply with respect to language. And therefore, it seems to me that the conveyance is bad, in part because there's no compensation. Indeed, one can take the argument one step further. And you could ask yourself the question, suppose they decided to pay a certain amount of money into the United States Treasury. Would that solve the problem? And the answer to that question is, if you think about it individual by individual, is no. It turns out that even though the term Olympics is in common usage so that everybody could utilize it, there are certain people who have differential investments in it. There are, for example, the Special Olympics, which are run for the benefit of crippled children. And if you put the money into the public treasury, what happens is these people are still going to be net losers, as those monies are spent on some general purpose from which they do not derive some kind of a special gain. So that if you really want to work the system, you have to be prepared to make compensation to handle for differential losses, and simple payments to the United States Treasury will not work. And in fact, I'm sufficiently confident under most circumstances that there's no aggregate gain that will be achieved by making the privatization of certain forms of public language, that I would treat the word as though it's part of the river, inalienable. Why inalienable? Because when you prevent alienation, you may prevent the movement of resources to higher use, but at the same time, you will prevent the systematic dangers of self-dealing, which, given the circumstances of the case, common assets, commonly used, sensibly used in the common, probably says it's not a transfer worth doing at all. Shutting the whole thing down is fine. Well, that may sound to you like something of a sport, so let me just close by taking into account two other cases, and then I think it'll be quite enough for an after-dinner speech. Too much for an after-dinner speech. One of the cases has to do with public employment. There is an open question, for example, in modern theory as to whether or not one ought to allow various kinds of public employees to form unions in order to bargain against the state or the local government. And the general view on this question is, well, it's all a matter of prudence. After all, we're told, mistakenly I might add, that unionization of private firms under the collective bargaining statute is unquestionably constitutional. So if in fact you can impose those kinds of duties on private employers, why can't the state simply assume that kind of obligation for itself? Well, it seems to me that the argument is wrong on both points. First, as a matter of principle, I won't concede that any mandatory collectivization of bargaining in the private sector is constitutional. In fact, in my book, I make rather extensive arguments that it's flatly unconstitutional. But suppose you get past that hurdle, and somebody says, but look, it's the government only doing it to itself. Well, now you've got the classic fallacy of composition. The government is not a single individual, it's large numbers of individuals. What you have, in effect, is an interest group play in which some people are doing it to other people. It's not all of us doing it to ourselves equally. And what you do is you have the pattern of disproportionate benefits and burdens from collective legislation, which is the hallmark of an implicit and illegal transfer. And what happens with respect to the unionization situation is you convert a competitive market into a monopolistic market. And at the very least, you get the welfare loss associated with what is technically called as the triangle. That is, there's some people who would pay something below the monopoly price but above the competitive price who are wiped out, and their utility does not get taken into account. And then there's the rectangle, which is the total amount of wealth transferred from consumers to producers by virtue of this shift, which may be dissipated in the endless political lobbying in order to get it. Well, if that's correct, then it turns out that there's no way that you could keep aggregate levels by customary theory up to the levels they were beforehand if you have this kind of a transfer. So what I would therefore conclude is that any effort on the part of the state, that is by certain interest groups within the state, to collectivize and cartelize a portion of the market would be per se unconstitutional. And if for those of you who were here in the afternoon session who heard about the multiple efforts on the part of the state to cartelize various kinds of markets, everything from raisins to the provisions of local services, if you understand the public trust doctrine aright, it turns out that all of those things are flatly, completely, and totally illegal by exactly the same kind of theory which allows the protection of private property under the Constitution to strike down most forms of New Deal legislation. And the last example that one wants to give is one that's very close to anybody's heart who lives in Chicago and always tries to battle his way into the airport. And what you typically discover is that there are a whole variety of exclusive franchises which say that only certain kinds of companies can use the public roads in order to go in and out of the very places that everybody wants to travel to. Indeed, it didn't start in Chicago, I want you to all know. There are long and honorable traditions in our history of exclusive franchises, and we've always been looking for an appropriate constitutional way in order to attack them. For example, one illustration of this is Gibbons against Ogden, which is the famous case which concerned the proper construction of the Commerce Clause in the 1820s by Chief Justice Marshall. But what was at stake in that case was an act by the New York State Legislature which gave the exclusive franchise for the operation of steamships in Hudson Bay in New York to Livingston and Fulton. And it turns out that here you took public waters and converted them to private use. And if you go to the slaughterhouse cases, what they did in effect was to create an exclusive franchise for butchery in the city of New Orleans in the hands of one or two operatives. Again, it's the taking of an open business and converting it into a closed one. And the same thing takes place with respect to the various uses of public highways. Now, if you follow the analysis that one's done and can be quite convinced of the general superior resource judgment with respect to open entry as opposed to closed and restricted entry, precisely because of the losses associated with monopoly, then what happens is you have a taking of property from the public and giving it to the private, where the rest of the public comes out as systematic net loser. And so the application of something like the public trust doctrine will prevent this whole welter of petty and exclusive franchises which has constantly littered the public sector of our economy. So it seems to me that if we have this public trust doctrine, there's an enormous amount that one can do with it. It becomes in its own way every bit as powerful and informative a club against large government as the eminent domain clause. Unfortunately, however, it's not clear that we do have this particular clause. The single most famous case of the public use was a case called Illinois Central against Illinois, which involved a decision by the state to revoke a grant which it had made to the Illinois State Railroad, and that decision to revoke was upheld by the Supreme Court on the ground that the original grant had been in violation of the public trust doctrine. And the opinion, to make things more mysterious, was written by a classic libertarian, Justice Stephen J. Field, and the reason he wrote it is that he understood the problems of self-dealing and was trying to craft some sort of constitutional doctrine to combat it. Now, the difficulty with the opinion is that he says it's a constitutional decision, but he manages to take the living constitutional fellows of today and put them something to shame, because at no point does he mention, cite, or even hint at which particular clause of which particular constitution may have been violated by that particular decision. So what we really have here is we have something like an unloaded gun. We have the most powerful theory imaginable, but it's not at all clear that we have any kind of obvious constitutional home with which to house it. But not to worry, it seems to me, in some sense. The Constitution with its protean provisions is probably equal to the task. If you look at the taxing power, you're told that it's limited to various kinds of expenditures for the general welfare and of the United States. And one of the things that you could start to say by that is when you start to create special deals for some individuals that exclude others, we are quite sure that the taxing power has been misaligned in ways that are congruent with the public trust doctrine. When you look at the Equal Protection Clause in state behavior, you can make a fairly credible argument that that clause is not tied in any explicit way to private property. It says, nor shall any person within the jurisdiction be denied equal protection of the laws. And if it turns out that you take something in which everybody has one interest, say in 100th, and you manage to convert it so one guy has it all and everybody else has none, they're not being equally treated. And in fact, some of them aren't even being protected at all, let alone being protected equally. And it turns out that there's, I think, an important lesson in all this. The basic structure of the arguments are essentially the same no matter what guarantee of the Constitution you're all looking at. In effect, what happens is the doctrine in its national law guise has fairly comprehensive protections for either freedom of speech or of religion or protection of private property or impairment of contract. And in effect, nobody who's serious about it can believe that they're absolute, if only because Justice Holmes for once was right when he said that you're not allowed to yell fire in a crowded theater causing panic. so that you have various kinds of limitations upon the freedom of exercise of speech or the protection of property. We're dealing with harms to strangers. That often goes under the rather unilluminating name of a compelling state interest to limit the exercise of an individual liberty. And then you have the whole question of whether or not, if in fact you're not within that class of externalities, whether or not just compensation has been provided when the liberties have in fact been restricted. And what I submit to you is that no matter where you start doctrinally, whether you start with specific guarantees like speech or religion or property, whether you start with clauses that are absolute on their face like the speech clause, or those which have just compensation provisions in them like the property clauses, it turns out that the same uniform analysis applies with respect to all of them. So that what happens is, if you understand the grand structure of the doctrine and of the basic uniform theory that underlies it, what happens is it turns out that political theory and interpretation tend to come together more closely than one would have otherwise expected. And the reason, I think, is one which has to be stressed again, is that constitutional interpretation may be strict in accordance with the principles that you use, given that the doctrine was in place. But if you remember, it's a doctrine which was basically animated, with a few exceptions, the slave cases and so forth, by a pretty coherent theory of limited government and private rights, then a successful application of all of the levers and all of the cranks and all of the screws will come out with a coherent theory at the end. And I would say, and I think this echoes something that Forrest MacDonald says today, when you look at many of the modern perversions that one sees of constitutional doctrine, you cannot find in them some sort of linguistic justification which says that the question was open. Almost invariably, if you look more closely, there's just some fundamental wrong textual move which leads you to a wholesale invalidation of important kinds of constitutional protections, or the misguided constitutional creation of certain kinds of liberties that ought in principle never to exist. So it seems to me that if you understand the theory and you understand the doctrine and you're reasonably patient with respect to both of them, you can find in the Constitution the protection, or the protection of individual liberties and the solution for limited government that I think many people here believe that it contains. Okay, thank you. What? Do you have, okay. Anything's fair. When you put yourself up like you can't go around and hide. I'll even stand in front of the microphone. I don't see any questions. Not even from, I thought I was going to hear from Gordon. Thank God. Yeah. Oh, I was at it. No, just shut him up. No, go ahead.
If you misspell a word,
yeah.
can you appropriate it like deer?
Oh, I mean, the question of whether or not I think that's a secondary meaning question. And my sense about it is that to the extent that you invest capital in a term and give it a new meaning, protection is going to be appropriate. To the extent that the meaning is, or the value in the term is already there before you get your hands on it, it is not. And there may be some marginal cases where you're not quite sure how much has been added, and nobody wants to say that the boundaries with respect to language are as clear as metes and bounds with respect to property. But what you want to say is that if you keep the principle clear, you could at least find out the few cases that are difficult. And thank heaven, I don't think light beer from Miller or anybody else is a particularly difficult one. Although the generic point is difficult. I think light beer, in effect, is a term which was probably understood before people began to market it. And in that sense, my guess is that you could not protect it. And indeed, that happens to be the way the cases came out, which is why you have more than Bud Light and so forth. So, intellectual property, by the way, is a wonderful subject, and it turns out the same principles apply to it as applied to everything else. What is difficult about it is that it turns out that you can't protect intellectual property by taking possession of it. So what you have to do is to substitute a series of legal rules with respect to use, which are much more complicated and cumbersome to enforce than the rules of exclusive possession. Or another way to say it, one of the problems about a good idea is that two people could have it at the same time, and one of the problems of that shared intelligence is it may be worth nothing to either once it turns out to be shared. Gordon, is that your eyes?
Yes, I will not ask why you're wicked. Why can't you sell an entire river?
I cut that out of the speech because, in fact, that's a nice question, Gordon. It turns out it's exceedingly difficult to do that, as you can imagine, in terms of finding the metes and bounds. The problem about doing that is that before you sold it, it turned out that there was essentially access at zero price with no discrimination with respect to everybody in question. Once you start to sell the thing off, presumably you're going to be able to get a price, but now you've got the problem of the monopoly. And my general answer to that question is you probably could sell the river if you imposed upon the purchaser the same limitations that are associated with common carriers general, which is that, in fact, they have to take all comers at a non-discriminatory price. Because once you start to allow the discrimination to take place within the price terms, you can't be sure that everybody's going to get as much back by access to this privately owned and maintained river as he could have gotten under the initial condition. Now, the reason why the case is exceedingly difficult is that it turns out that rivers are wasting assets like anything else in this world. And one of the difficulties about leaving them in public hands is that you have the Army Corps of Engineers trying to dredge them. And it may well be, therefore, that the maintenance problem will be destructive and the privatization will be superior. So it seems to me that if what you do is impose certain kinds of restrictions of the common carrier type, that maybe it ought to be in principle possible, and so therefore the answer, selling it off, was meant to be selling it off to somebody who could use it as an unbounded monopolist, and I would make that qualification. Yes? Oh no, my God, the heavies are after me. What is it, Peter?
Well,
Yes, I agree. And on the other hand, however, now that you've mentioned the point, yes, you know the Milton joke. Oh, Christ. Why a little? Why not a lot?
We grant the inalienability of the river and the severability of the mineral rights under it. And then we are imposing under this theory, which has some attractiveness to it, a certain degree of enhanced scrutiny of the transaction between the agent of the state, the agent of all of us, and the person of the private sector who's getting this.
You understand perfectly.
Now, on the other hand, if we look at the analog in the private sector, it's neither so easy nor so exact as you've made out in your talk, which I find otherwise fully accurate. For example, there is the old business judgment rule.
Absolutely right.
There is also the matter that which in the past would have protected managers for lots of these sorts of things.
Okay, man.
Until the recent craziness. And then there was also the whole notion of capital market theory that there's some virtue in having entrepreneurs running around looking for undervalued assets that no one else has discovered. Unless we suppress the search for such assets and all of the value that creates, it strikes me that the enhanced scrutiny you're imposing might very well turn out to be damaging to the public interest.
You're giving, that's the long version of the paper. But you're right. I mean, but let's just try to take the points one after another, okay? Point number one, the business judgment rule is obviously going to be appropriate because if you think of the arguments that one's made about analogizing this to the private trust or the private corporation, it turns out the increased scrutiny rules do not kick in every case. They only kick in some cases. What happens is that they tend to kick in under those circumstances where the conflict of interest is greatest, and that is roughly identified in those cases where it turns out that there's self-dealing between the members of the trustee and somebody on the outside. And it could be that they're buyers and members of their family are buyers and so forth. And it seems to me that what one has to really ask about in the political context is, given that the political market for public officials doesn't work in quite the same way as the market for officers, that the dangers of self-dealing are going to be somewhat greater, so that the need for scrutiny is going to be somewhat more powerful. So that it turns out that the self-dealing problem is more acute, it seems to me functionally, and so therefore that risk is there. Okay. The second half, which again you're right, is it turns out that the finding of value in these cases may in effect reflect two things. It may reflect that you have mineral rights, which are basically perfectly fungible and everybody's aware about it, and so it's just a question of bidding to get the most efficient producer. But then there's this other side, the search side, that there may well be assets which have value, which only some people perceive and others don't. And what it seems to me is that when you start talking about just scrutiny, to the extent that you have any kind of an ordinary auction or any kind of an independent evaluation by the state, typically that will not capture those subjective values, and that would be sufficient under my point of view to do it, because essentially you've always got to protect two kinds of incentives. Those on the public people not to misbehave, and those on the private people to make the original investments. And basically, essentially, that suggests that no corner solution, which gives all the surplus to one side or the other, is going to be appropriate, and that's exactly the way in which one would want to come out. I mean, one of the interesting things that I left out in the talk, which is in the written paper, is that if you actually try to figure out the way in which the conflict of interest rules work, it turns out that two things happen simultaneously. It turns out that you have a greater need for them in the public sector, given the way in which political officials tend to take place, but it's also it's much more clumsy and difficult for you to figure out a way to impose the restrictions which turn out to have greater necessity. And so since the trade-offs between the optimal level of freedom and the optimal level of restraint work unfavorably in the public sector, it's just a very strong argument in favor of private property. It turns out that, for example, if you take the foundation business, which is one of my favorite, you do work with the National Endowment for the Humanities, they can't change forms unless they get the approval of OMB because everybody's afraid they're trying to give business to their brother-in-law. And so that the degree of scrutiny that it turns out that they have is just much higher than the degree of scrutiny that any private foundation imposes upon that kind of relatively routine task. And yet the need for it turns out to be greater, and the implication you draw from that is perfectly clear. You close the operation down because it turns out that it just can't possibly compete given these problems with private sides. And the implication, therefore, is from the general theory, is that there really has to be a common, which nobody else could replicate in the private market before you keep this thing under government control. And there are relatively precious few of them. And, for example, Gordon made the point, why do you have to have the government own the river? Gordon's point is the government may have to exercise the condemnation power, but there's no reason it has to run the railroad. And it's exactly the same kind of point, and the issue is what kind of quid pro quo you impose upon the railroad for giving it that power. And if there's a monopoly problem, well, you have to impose non-discrimination conditions. But if there are enough competition around there, enough riverways close enough to one another, you could forget about all that, use the government for assembly, and then sell the unit off to a competitive bid and let the private guys keep the surplus, which seems to me to be the right answer. So I think basically we're in agreement. It's just a question that pumping out the theory in its absolute fullness requires a couple more wrinkles than one went to. But I think, in fact, it's a pretty powerful theory. And it's amazing when you look at the literature on the public trust doctrine. Essentially, it's an environmental war club, used in good cases and bad cases alike, with a kind of a, shall we say, uncritical application as to what it's about and how it ties in with a general and more comprehensive theory of social control. Is there anyone who has a friendly question? Ah! Thank you. Well, as I said before, it seems to me that the public trust doctrine is one of these things which does not have an explicit textual table in front of it the way in which the private eminent domain clause, and I think that the Stephen J. Field problem puts that there. What I tried to give, at least at one level, was an equal protection type argument. In effect, if you assume that there are certain degrees of holding that the public has, in which we could then measure everybody's private interest in that public account, what we want to say is that equal treatment says that each of these people with respect, or equal protection says that each of these people with respect to their fractional interest in the public whole gets the same rate of return on their investment. And it turns out that that condition cannot be satisfied to the extent that some people keep all the lolly and the others are left holding all the dust. And the reason that I would say that that's a principled interpretation is because what it does, and here Peter and Aronson and I are at one, is it says that serious application of the equal protection clause in the Constitution is not in any obvious sense a function of you first finding some fundamental right or suspect classification. Those are terms which are nowhere in the document. It's basically a function of differential treatment. And what one would want to do in order to get this result is to reverse what I think is a rather insidious line of Supreme Court decisions, which essentially says that we figure out what are those provisions in the Constitution that are written in red ink, and those we really protect to the hilt, and those which are written in black, and those we more or less ignore. And what I'm saying, in effect, the whole document's a red-letter document, and that the level of protection ought to be uniform. And if you take that theory, you have to reject basically all of modern Supreme Court equal protection law, but that's a strength in favor of the argument rather than a weakness, because the gloss that they put on it is nowhere there textually. The clause is perfectly comprehensive. And once you get away from the idea that the application of a doctrine depends on the applications that its grantors thought of it, then in effect you have to treat the text as a self-contained entity and ask why it is you put the implication in, and it turns out that there's absolutely no occasion or principle for doing it. Indeed, you can have many more vicious wealth transfers in the so-called non-preferred interest than you can in the preferred interest kinds of cases. So that, or at least there's no obvious correlation. You could have big swindles in economic cases and small one in race cases, and vice versa. And I have no desire to undo the scrutiny that are given in other areas. Indeed, I would make exactly the opposite argument, which is to the extent that the court has been able to develop a reasonably coherent and stable doctrine, independent of any theory to explain what they're doing. They are innocent of that. That theory could be carried over to the areas in which they refuse to apply it. And if you go back and you look what's driving them, it turns out that there's a thing known as footnote 4, the Caroline Products footnote, and that's always the problem of factions and discrete and insular minorities and political intrigue. It's the Madisonian concern. And the central point to remember is that concern doesn't stop with fundamental rights and suspect classifications. It's all pervasive. And if you have a constant government disease, it seems to me you need a constant constitutional cure. And the texts were written in the right way, and it's just our job to follow them rather than the gloss. So I'm not at all uncomfortable with reading this thing in some sense, because I think it's actually, once you understand that equal protection isn't tied to private property, the way the eminent domain clause is, it turns out the equality provision is very much tied into the comprehensive analysis for the protection of all property. That is, there is something in the eminent domain clause known as the equal protection dimension of it, because essentially when you're trying to figure out how you handle the compensation question, when you have comprehensive government takings, that is taxation, inequality of treatment is a very powerful game theoretical telltale sign of implicit and impermissible transfers. And a lot of people have sort of understood that equal treatment is required under the eminent domain clause. What they were unable to do was to realize that it wasn't an intuition which was ungrounded in text, but rather it was a necessary application of how we measure compensation when direct measurement is not possible. And that's by seeing the incentives that work upon people and the way in which those games play themselves out. It is 9:30. It is 15 minutes. I'll take no more questions unless anyone has one more question. Gwartney, what's your question? When will I sit down and shut up? Is that the question? Right now.